Well, I just want to introduce the director, producer and director, Eric Stange. Eric is the executive producer and founder of Spike Pond Productions in Arlington. He's a writer, director, and producer of documentary television programs on history, science, and technology. His work has appeared on PBS, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and the BBC. As you saw in this work, he specializes in both long and short format projects that combine rigorous research with innovative visualization techniques and imaginative storytelling. Eric has been a recipient of the Charles Warren Fellowship in American History from Harvard University. He is a member of the board of Commonplace, the leading academic website for studies in early American history, and writes a column for American Heritage magazine on history and new media, and is a visiting fellow with the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship. Our film editor is with us tonight, Peter Rhodes. He is a veteran film editor who was trained at the BBC in London, and he has more than 50 credits, including documentaries and feature films that have appeared at Sundance and other festivals. So welcome, Eric and Peter. Thank you. So I think that perhaps we should start out, and I'm going to come over and join you all, with just how did this film come to be? What was the inception and the process?
Well, it came about because about 5 or 6 years ago, actually in 2008, 2009, I made a film about the fall of the Berlin Wall for the celebrations of the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in the course of making that film, I interviewed Baker, and the executive producer of that film, a man in Houston, Texas. He realized, and I realized, that Baker has a very interesting story in and of himself. I have to confess, before I did that film on the Berlin Wall, I really had not known much about Baker at all. I mean, I hadn't paid a whole lot of attention, for some reason, to Republican presidents or their foreign policy, and it was in doing this film about that period and about the role of the Bush 1 administration and Baker in the end of the Cold War that I realized there's actually a really interesting story there.
Eric, did you, you're a historian and do a lot of research. Did it require a lot of research before you started the actual filming process?
A certain amount, but it turns out that for some reason every public figure from the 1980s and early 1990s wrote a huge memoir, every single one of them. I mean, it was amazing. There was not one person, I think, that we interviewed who had written some monster book, which doesn't mean that it was necessarily an accurate history of what went on, but at least it made it very easy to go and find out what they, at least, the story they were telling. So that made a huge difference, including Baker, who had written 2 memoirs. So that made it easier. But a lot of the sort of inside stuff came from talking to Baker himself or other people. One of the things that turned out to be very difficult was trying to find somebody who would say anything bad about Baker for some reason. And I learned there just really weren't very many political insiders, or in fact we couldn't find anyone who would say anything really negative about Baker. I mean, nobody. There are journalists, of course, who would, and people who write particularly, of course, from a progressive perspective, but even they did not have very sharp things to say about Baker.
You had a very impressive group of people that you were interviewing. How did you gain access to these prominent people?
Yeah, well, that was not very hard, it turned out, because most of them were happy to talk about Baker. It was really, I mean, in some ways it was the easiest film I've ever made, because even Clinton, I mean, it took a long time to get on Clinton's schedule, but from the very beginning we were, you know, they kind of said, oh, it's about Baker, yeah, you know, this might work. And same with Carter. I mean, for Carter we had to go to Plains, Georgia, which turns out not to be so easy, but he was willing to talk about Baker. And Cheney, not surprisingly, I think he was willing to talk about anything, so that wasn't too hard. Yeah, just they love Baker, and they were happy to talk about him, and you can't really tell from what ended up in the film, but I really did try to get people to say negative things about him, and they just, yeah, it's Washington. I mean, they're going to be very cautious about what they say, but yeah, it was not hard for most of those people.
With all the interviews that you conducted, was there one or two situations that were rather surprising and or difficult, unique in some fashion that stand out?
Peter, do you remember anything from having? Peter had to watch every interview all the way through, so which is kind of different from actually doing it. I think he probably knows him better than I do. But I don't know. Kissinger was. Yeah, Kissinger.
Yeah, Kissinger was very interesting, very hard to understand. We would have used more of him, except that we should subtitle him actually. And Cheney was a very interesting interview. He had a lot of interesting stories, but I don't know. Even when he was just telling like an amusing anecdote, somehow it was very hard to take on screen.
In what sense?
Well, there just was a sort of there was something sinister about him. Even when he was telling a joke somehow, it just seemed kind of nasty. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
You know, actually, Sabinius was one of the most interesting interviews.
The guy who was the head of the negotiation program. It's a joint program of Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. And Jim Sabinius was, you know, a Harvard professor, not the kind of person that normally I would think to talk about Baker, but it turned out that program had given Baker a big award a couple of years ago. They gave him their Negotiator of the Year award, something like that. So Sabinius was more than happy to talk about Baker, and it was great to hear him from a sort of academic point of view dissect how Baker did what he did in negotiations. And Sabinius actually teaches case studies from Baker's career in his class to Harvard Business School students. Just go back to Kissinger. I think the problem was that we did the interview after lunch, and I think he had a 2 or 3 martini lunch, because it was just really difficult.
Coupled with his accent, right? Okay. Sebelius, Professor Sebelius, he teaches negotiation, is that correct?
Yes.
So he's using Baker as an example of a great negotiator.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. There's, you know, making films or writing books or anything is often an exercise in leaving out stuff that you would rather have in. June 1989 was Tiananmen Square, and a huge problem for the Bush administration, because they were trying to make overtures to China. They were trying to set themselves apart from the Reagan administration somehow, and they thought one way to do it was to be more open to a dialogue with China, and then Tiananmen Square happened, and so they were kind of in a box. It just wasn't a story that panned out, but it was certainly a huge problem for them. But so you can't include everything. Do you remember anything? Okay. Yeah, I think we just at one point everything is in, and that's the 3-hour. That's the 3-hour version, and then you have to start cutting it down.
And we actually, another criterion for choosing what to go in was choosing stories that could help sort of illustrate his personality or his style or something like that. So to go into depth in, into a few stories, but to have covered everything would have ended up, just more like a list of current events rather than any kind of analysis.
Yeah, just one more quick point about that. One of the other issues we always run into is what do we have footage for? And sometimes there's a really interesting bit of history that you just have nothing to show. I mean, you have to have an image for every moment. And you can see we really stretch things out, and sometimes all these airplanes taking off and landing, but you can't do that forever. So yeah, that enters into those decisions as well.
Did you meet with James Baker several different times during the filming process?
Yeah, I interviewed him, I think, 4 times. And, we didn't go to great pains to try to make it look like one long interview. I mean, it's clearly lit differently in some cases, and he's wearing different ties. I think that's the only way we could ever tell apart. But he always has a $2,000 suit on, but the tie's changed. So we'd say, oh, the red tie or the blue tie interview. And then we were able to go hunting with him. You saw that at the beginning of the film. And went fishing, hunting in South Texas, fishing in Wyoming. He has a nice life. The easiest way to put it is that he masterminded the Bush strategy. And I think as one of the commentators says, from the first day that he got to Florida, which was literally the day after the election that was disputed, Baker was saying, we've got to get this to the U.S. Supreme Court. Because Baker, he told a lot more of the story, and you just can't put everything in. In one of the interviews, he talked about the fact that he played golf with the governor of Florida, Lawton Childs, who's a Democrat. They were golfing buddies. And so he knew from Lawton Childs who all the members of the Florida Supreme Court were, and he knew that they were all liberal Democrats, and he knew that they were never going to stand a chance with the Florida Supreme Court. So whatever they did, they had to get it out of Florida. So that was part of what he was doing. But it's also, as Clinton says, he just outmaneuvered the Democrats. I mean, Gore, one of the things Baker told us that's not in the film is that Gore tried to micromanage his strategy. He was constantly, first he had Warren Christopher, then he got rid of Warren Christopher and had, I think, David Boyce, one of the lawyers, and then he got rid of Boyce and someone else. And was on the phone with them for hours every day about how they were going to do this and that. Whereas Baker said Bush and Cheney called him once every morning at 10 o'clock and would say, what's going to happen today? And Baker would tell them, and that was it. And otherwise they left him alone. And obviously it worked for them, yeah. But yeah, his strategy, he was the chief strategist. And just one other thing about that, like a lot of people, I always thought that that election was essentially stolen. And then I think after this, I'd be more apt to describe it as it wasn't stolen, the Democrats gave it away, essentially.
No, I think the giving it away is accurate, yeah. I think I think it was, Gore was too afraid to have a recount of the whole state. And once Baker saw that he was afraid to do that, he knew that he had the advantage.
But do you remember when Tipper Gore led the campaign against Frank Zappa, singled out, not Frank Zappa, Frank Zappa led the campaign back, but Tipper Gore started a campaign about rock and roll lyrics, trying to get rock and roll songs labeled and this and that, and it turned out she was doing it with Susan Baker. The two of them were partners in that. I hadn't noticed that at the time. So that was interesting, and of course I had to read a whole lot more about it, since you have to read everything you can find about people before you interview them. And I have to say, I kind of, as a parent, I wasn't a parent, I think, when that was unfolding, but was a parent when I was reading about it. And this is one of the many sort of surprises I had doing this film, is that they weren't trying to censor rock and roll, they were trying to get records labeled, which may or may not have any effectiveness, I don't think it does, but they were, it sort of made more sense, and it all happened because Susan Baker was washing dishes one night with her 7-year-old daughter, and Madonna's Like a Virgin came on the radio, and her daughter at 7 is saying, what's a virgin, and what's this about, and as a parent, I could actually sort of see, it is too bad that you have to have these conversations because of mass media. And I can't say agree with her or thought they did the right thing, but it was just interesting to hear. She also, by the way, has been very active in pro-Palestinian causes in the Middle East. So, she's a surprising person. Nice.
Also, actually, something that's in the interview which we didn't use, but she was very nice about Hillary Clinton, wasn't she?
Yeah.
When the Clintons first came to power and she was still, a powerful woman in Washington, they had they used to have like breakfast get-togethers or something like that, and they invited Hillary, and she was really quite nice about it, which was surprising.
Yeah, well, the first question is a lot easier. There are 9 kids, I think. I can't remember now, 8 or 9. And I interviewed one. I think he's the eldest son, James A. Baker, the 5th or whatever he's now. He was a very nice man, but didn't, I wanted to hear more about Jim Baker's brush with alcoholism and how hard it was after these kids' mother had died and all that. But he wasn't talking about that, so. The other kids, some of them have had pretty, not hugely troubled lives, but the usual stumbles. Alan thing. It's funny that I don't think there's one that's sort of got all that inner strength that Baker has somehow, or whatever, the ambition or whatever that mixture is. It just didn't seem to be much there. The youngest one, the daughter who was born, who's the only child that's actually Jim and Susan's, is an actress in Hollywood, and very nice. I met her, but there didn't seem like it was going to add to the story. The second question is much harder. There were times when I thought, and I think we talked about this, maybe we never even got that far, when I thought, well, when the Reagan era comes to an end, we got to do something about, what the Reagan era led to. So what was we started in 1980, when it ends in 88, what are we going to say about it? And then the savings and loan story got into the film, and that seemed to be enough. You can't, it's just hard to fit everything in. And if this film had been being made by somebody who, I make films for PBS. They end up on PBS. PBS has certain standards and certain formats, and they want a kind of a balance, what they consider a balance, and that's how I was going to make the film. And I couldn't make a film that was too friendly toward Baker, because PBS wouldn't want it, and I couldn't make a film that was coming from the point of view of a writer for the nation or something, because PBS doesn't show that either, unless it's a real expose. If I had come across some real dirt, some real story that was worth telling, I could have done that, but I didn't. So it was, it was hard at times. It is. It's
actually, put it another way, I was very surprised in making the film at how so much more moderate even Reagan was than the current Republicans. Because I had remembered from my youth that Reagan was this right-wing nut who was going to bring about nuclear destruction. And in hearing people talk about his pragmatism and even the idea of hiring Baker as his point man, who was clearly a moderate, and the idea of compromising. In fact, actually, the sequence I always enjoyed, they used to make fun of me because the sequence in the film that I always liked the best was the one about tax reform. I never thought I had a long scene about tax reform, but the idea of the way they went about compromising on that to me was fascinating. And what we look back on as and thought of as such a right-wing era to even engage in that kind of compromise in American government was fascinating. So, there were things about the Reagan era that we just had to leave that. It was a film about Baker and not Baker. So there are things, there are things we disapproved of that were just are not mentioned because they're just not part of our story. I guess that was part of it. That was what was challenging, I guess.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. I mean, the reason I gave the mic to Peter first was, remember, I think you once said at some point that it's more interesting for us, and in some ways probably makes a more interesting film that we didn't share those politics. And yet we're finding it really interesting and really illuminating in some ways. And yeah, things like tax reform. I mean, that tax reform bill in 1986 was the last time there has been any kind of reasonable tax reform in this country. And it really did get rid of tons of loopholes. I don't know if any of you happen to be sailboat people, but I know that if you look at sailboats, they stopped making sailboats in about 1988 because Baker had done away with the loophole for owning luxury boats. And so about 10 sailboat companies just went out of business. Same with racehorse owners, thoroughbreds. There was a huge collapse in the racehorse market because Baker got rid of all those loopholes. He did not get rid of loopholes for oil and gas, but he did get rid of all sorts of loopholes for business people. 3 martini lunch, I don't know if you remember that, but that was done with in that tax bill. And then very quickly, Congress put them all back. I mean, it really was just a matter of a couple of years before all those things just boom, 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 came right back. But for a while, it really was a much simpler, fairer tax code.
So cheap.
Yeah, I think one of the hard ones was Bill Clinton, because Baker had already told us the story that at the Bush inauguration, Clinton, Baker described this moment where Clinton leaned over and said, "You did good in Florida, real good," and Baker just loved that. As you can imagine, I mean, what a way to be told you're a winner. So of course I wanted to ask Bill Clinton his side of that story. He didn't remember that at all. I mean, it took a lot. I really had to work myself up being asked it because it's kind of embarrassing no matter what. But actually Clinton he just kind of thought for a minute and he said, and you heard the answer he gave, which was basically, I don't remember that. We cut that part out. But he says, but yeah, he had a great hand and he played it really well. And, that was good enough, but it was a disappointment at the time. I'm trying to think of other tough things. I mean, some of the questions I asked Baker, I felt like would be, I was a little tentative about. I can't remember a good example, but things were, I know when he tried to become national security advisor, but failed quite miserably, but he was totally candid about it. I mean, he was really candid about everything. I can't think of anything, and part of this is because it's the topic, and part of it was because we were not trying to get people to confess or expose something that hadn't been confessed to or exposed before. So they were all fairly friendly interviews for the most part. No one was in on the decision. It was all Bush's decision, and I've heard that from a lot of people. I believe Baker on that one. And then, he wasn't going to trash Dan Quayle, at least to me. I mean, maybe he wouldn't drive it, but he wasn't going to say anything nice about him either. He has a great, it's what Lesley Stahl said, he has a great way of just deflecting, and you don't even know somehow that you're being deflected until afterwards you realize, wait a minute, that's not what I asked at all. But meanwhile, he's telling you something equally interesting, just not what you asked. Yeah, we did occasionally. Yeah, his time is kind of precious. I mean, we didn't get a whole lot of time with him each time, a couple of hours, so we do that over lunch or we do that around the edges, but I knew that these films take a long time to make and they don't appear on TV until long after they're made, 6 months or a year even sometimes. And so you don't really want to get into current day stuff because it's going to be stale. So for the actual film, I wish we could have, but I knew things would have changed. But yeah, he's full of interesting observations. And I was actually with him the day, not for interview, and this was much later, but we were doing an event in New York City showing the film. And I'll try to make the story brief, because it's kind of a fun story. Fareed Zakaria, who's a CNN commentator, was the host of this little event at CNN, and it was Baker, and then and Fareed Zakaria interviewed Baker on stage. And then we were all having dinner, just like, I don't know, probably 12 people. And Fareed Zakaria's phone rang, his cell phone, and he said, "Oh, excuse me a minute." He got up from the dinner table and left, and spent about 10 minutes on the phone, and came back and said, and my wife said to him, "Babysitter trouble?" He said, "Actually, no, that was the president calling to talk to Fareed Zakaria about the Iran deal. That it was April 1st, I think, Obama had just announced, it was the first announcement of this pending Iran deal. It was the first public announcement of it. And Obama was calling personally several news people to, win them over, give them his side of the story. And then Fareed Zakaria proceeded to tell us, he said, "Don't tell anyone but," and then told us everything Obama said. And obviously, I never would have been there enough for Baker, so that was a fun moment. And then it was really interesting to hear Baker talk to Zakaria, ask Zakaria questions. Well, what about this and that? And, at the end of that, sort of hearing Obama's side of the story, Fareed Zakaria, Baker said, if he can pull that off, that's going to be a good thing. If he can do this, what everyone says. But it was just really interesting to hear Baker hear his questions, hear him come to a conclusion quite quickly. I mean, he knew some about it already. Everybody knew some, but that was a great moment. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's thinking all the steps ahead. He did want to run in '96, and he came very close to doing it. He raised a lot of money. And that would have been against Clinton at the end of Clinton's first term. And then what he told me, and I asked him about this on camera, but we sort of didn't get to that point. But what he told me was that he just realized he didn't have the fire in his belly. That you gotta want that more than anything else in the world. And by that point, he said he'd been in Washington. He had his 12 years in Washington, and he was home for a few years, and he said he kind of liked being home. He realized he didn't want to be back in Washington fighting all those battles. I don't think he would have won. I don't think he's got the personal charisma. He certainly got the smarts, and he certainly got the skills and all that. And I think in many ways he probably would have been a very good president, particularly in foreign policy. I think he would have been a very business-friendly president, but he would have been good with foreign policy, but I don't think he would have made it. We showed it to him in a room about like this, except there were only 5 of us in the front row, or maybe I guess we're 2 or 3 rows back. And it's a little nerve-wracking, because I'm used to making historical documentaries about dead people, essentially. And I rarely have to show the films to the subjects. And so we're sitting there in the whole film, and at the end of it, lights came up, and he says, "That was great. That was great. Of course, what else can I say? It's all about me." And then, of course, he went on to find things he didn't like the savings and loan sequence. He said, "Treasury, we couldn't have done anything. We couldn't have even done it." So we still have to raise $75,000 is our goal for the Kickstarter campaign. So we have 1 month starting tonight to raise that.
Well, we wish you luck with that. And on behalf of the Arlington International Film Festival, we thank you for this insightful documentary, a breath of hope as well, that maybe we might find times again that we can work across the aisle and actually make progress for the American people. So thank you both for that. And we thank you for coming this evening. We invite you to the festival, October 15 through 22, at the Kendall Square Cinema. And have a lovely evening. Thank you.